This is a piece of racing history here in Daytona Beach. The last part of famed NASCAR mechanic Smokey Yunick's garage was gutted by fire tonight and is being called suspicious.
So if we were running Fords last year and we thought Oldsmobile was faster this year, we switched. We didn't have any legal.
When Smokey Yunick passed away, the doors to his legendary garage were finally opened. What lay inside stunned everyone who stepped into the Daytona Beach workshop he had guarded for decades. For more than 50 years, Yunick had hidden away experimental engines, radical race cars, and mechanical ideas so unconventional that even NASCAR and Detroit were often kept in the dark.
I found the physics very intriguing. In other words, I was quite shocked to find out that what seemed so complex.
But once the locks were broken, the world was finally allowed to see the full extent of his engineering obsession. So what exactly was inside Smokey Yunick's secret garage? And which of his most unusual creations did his family choose never to part with? Join us as we uncover the cars, engines, and inventions he left behind. The solitary architect of Beach Street. For someone who claimed to have had 3 first names at some point, none of them hit quite as hard as his nickname, Smokey. It was around 1939. A teenage Smokey, having already constructed his own tractor from a junked car at age 12, threw his slight frame onto the saddle of a cheap, unreliable motorcycle and entered a half-mile dirt race. He had built the motorcycle with failing engine rings, so for every lap he completed, black oil smoke trailed behind him like a shroud. The track announcer, who had forgotten the young man's name entirely, watched this cloud approach lap after lap, and finally shouted into his microphone, "Here comes Smokey." And that was how Smokey Yunick was born. A few years later, when World War II erupted, Smokey joined the Army Air Corps, where he took the controls of a B-17 Flying Fortress. He was assigned to the 39th Bombardment Squadron, and with his aircraft named Smokey and the Fireman, he went on more than 50 high-stakes bombing missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. By the time the war was over, Smokey had gone from being an innocent teenager with an inventor's mind to a man who had stared death in the face from 20,000 feet. But one thing remained unchanged: his inventor mindset. During a training flight at war, Smokey was in the skies when he first sighted Daytona Beach, Florida. The view from above was all he needed to decide that was where he was going to settle down. So, in 1946, with the war behind him and exactly $300 in his pocket, Smokey bought a plot right on the beach waterfront. Partnering with local automotive mogul J. Saxton Lloyd to secure his footprint on Beach Street, he then set to work with his own 2 hands to build what he would later call the best damn garage in town. By the time he was done building his garage, the world soon realized it was no mere garage. Sure, it wasn't prime real estate, as the property would be half submerged at high tide, but with its high walls, massive deadbolts, and entirely blacked-out windows, Smokey had built a fortress with a river at its back and a highway at its front. Inside that fortress, Smokey Yunick existed in a state of near monastic devotion to his craft. He worked 18-hour days under the buzzing fluorescent lights in his factory. But the devotion came at a cost: his family. While Smokey worked, anyone who came to the doors would either get drowned out by country music or yelled at. Smokey was always building, and for a long time, no one really knew what he was up to. But soon, the work he was doing in that fortress would cement Smokey Yunick's reputation as the most dangerous mind in American motorsports. Smokey's 3 mic drops. The 1960 Indianapolis 500 was supposed to be the coronation of corporate racing, a showcase for the big money teams with their factory backing and endless resources. Smokey Yunick rolled in with the Ken Paul Special, a hand-built machine that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard next to the sleek sponsored entries. But Smokey understood something the establishment didn't. Appearances were weapons. He had mounted the engine sideways, the crankshaft running counterclockwise to fight the centrifugal forces threatening to pull the car off the track. The design was so radical that officials couldn't even comprehend what they were seeing. When Jim Rathman crossed the finish line first in that low-budget jalopy from a waterfront garage, Smokey had done the unthinkable. He had beaten them with his brain, not his budget. 8 years later, at the 1968 Daytona 500, Smokey delivered a lesson in humiliation so funny that people still tell the story today. NASCAR technical director Ernie Moore, suspecting the usual Smokey skullduggery, ordered the fuel tank removed entirely. He inspected the empty space and started ticking off violations, one after another. 9 of them. Smokey stood there with that corncob pipe clenched between his teeth, listening to every word. When Ernie finished, Smokey looked him dead in the eye and delivered one of the greatest lines in motorsports history. "You better make it 10, Ernie." Then he climbed into the tankless car, turned the key, and drove right out of the track gates and onto the public highway. Everyone was shocked. How was that even possible? Turned out, there was an 11-foot fuel line hidden inside the frame rails, holding nearly 5 U.S. gallons of gasoline. Smokey hadn't cheated. After all, the rules said nothing about fuel line length. But that fuel line was just a warm-up act compared to what he pulled 2 years earlier at the 1966 Daytona 500. The Heat Manifesto. NASCAR officials, desperate to stop Smokey's aerodynamic wizardry, had introduced templates of physical forms that every car had to fit perfectly. Smokey looked at those templates and saw a puzzle, not a wall. Legend has it that Smokey decided to build a Chevrolet Chevelle where every single body panel was scaled down to exactly 1/8 of its production size. To the naked eye, it looked identical to any other Chevelle on the track. But the templates didn't fit, and it took NASCAR officials most of the racing season to figure out why. Eventually, they realized that they'd been measuring a car that was 7/8 the size they expected. The discovery led to permanent production car templates, a rule change that fundamentally altered the sport forever. Majorly because of Smokey. In his later years, Smokey turned his relentless mind toward a problem that had plagued the automotive industry since the very first engine sputtered to life: waste heat. He called standard radiators monuments to failure because they threw away roughly 70% of fuel energy as heat. The entire industry was built on the assumption that engines needed cool air to run efficiently, and Smokey saw that as not just wrong, but actively destructive. He started experimenting with what he called the hot vapor cycle, a radical idea that proposed heating the air-fuel mixture instead of cooling it. The establishment laughed at him. Detonation, they said, was inevitable. But Smokey retreated to his fortress on Beach Street, determined to prove that conventional wisdom was just a fancy name for collective ignorance. And yes, he did prove them wrong with a sluggish 90-horsepower Pontiac Fiero, a car so unremarkable it had become a punchline. Smokey and his collaborator Ralph Johnson built a modified turbocharger that he called a homogenizer that heated the air-fuel mixture to 450 degrees Fahrenheit before it ever hit the cylinders. The results were staggering: 250 horsepower and 51 miles per gallon on pump gas. The stock Fiero, by comparison, managed just 90 horsepower and 35 miles per gallon. Smokey had done more than improve an engine. He had reinvented the fundamental physics of combustion itself, proving that the global automotive industry had been chasing the wrong answer for a century. The hot vapor Fiero, was a defiant middle finger to every engineer who had dismissed him as a backyard tinkerer. And it was that exact same stubbornness he used to fight the global automotive empire over heat cycles, was the exact stubbornness he would use to face the final battle of his life, the uncompromising exit. By the late 1990s, the machine that was Smokey Yunick was failing. A blood disorder that had lurked in his system for years had turned into aggressive, terminal leukemia. Smokey, who had spent his life fixing broken things, knew this was one problem he couldn't solve. The doctors offered treatments and machines that might buy him months, maybe even years, but Smokey had watched too many men make desperate deals with death in the skies over Europe to fall for borrowed time. In late 2000, with the leukemia already eating him alive, Smokey sat for a public interview and delivered a line that cut straight to the bone. "When the engine is worn out," he said, "you don't keep replacing the spark plugs just to hear it idle." To him, the dialysis machines, the ventilators, the monitors and tubes, they were just spark plugs, temporary fixes for a problem that had no solution. He wanted no part of it, so he decided to stop his medications. He told his family he wanted to die at home, on his feet if possible, not hooked to hospital tubes like a car on a lift. He told them he'd lived a baseline phenomenal life and had zero regrets. Just a man looking back on 77 years and finding nothing worth apologizing for. He was ready to go, and he'd go on his terms. On May 9, 2001, 77-year-old Smokey Yunick passed away peacefully at home in Daytona Beach. He was laid to rest privately, and the racing world mourned the loss of an icon. But before he went, Smokey had given his family one final command that would shape his legacy as much as anything he'd ever built. "Do not turn my garage into a museum," he told them. "Do not let people gawk at my life." He wanted his things scattered to working people, to the grease-stained mechanics who would actually use them, not to collectors who would display them behind glass like trophies. So his widow, Marge, made the announcement that shook the racing world. The fortified doors of the best damn garage in town, sealed against the world for more than half a century, were finally being unlocked. The heavy deadbolts that had guarded his secrets for 50 years were finally turning, and the morning of the auction would transform the sacred Beach Street compound into something it had never been. Open to everyone. What would they find in Smokey's sanctuary? Scattered to the working class. The February morning in 2002 dawned over Daytona Beach with a stillness, as if the city itself understood that something historic was about to unfold. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, hundreds of people had already gathered outside the gates of 957 North Beach Street. Independent grease monkeys stood shoulder to shoulder with wealthy collectors on the dusty concrete floor. The doors were finally opened to the shop that had been frozen in time since Smokey's 1987 retirement, smelling heavily of old motor oil, metal shavings, and stale pipe tobacco. Against the coiffed hair, designer sunglasses, and corporate logos of modern racing, Smokey's vintage world stood defiant. First went the everyday tools. People picked up his manual shop fender hammers, grease-stained oil hubs, rusted vintage hubcaps, miscellaneous exhaust pipes, and even his heavy manual office typewriter. These weren't collector's items. They were working tools sold for only a few dollars. But when a local mechanic bought one, he held it in his hands knowing a legend once used it to create masterpieces that fought the corporate system. Every single item that was sold off that floor came with an official letter of authenticity signed directly by Marge Yunick. Unlike the working tools, the custom flow benches were sold for thousands. Smokey had used them to secretly warp aerodynamics and test airflow with surgical precision. His legendary handmade bearing sorter, a wooden and metal tray with custom-cut slots, entirely hand-stamped and numbered by Smokey, was snapped up by an engine builder. The device could flawlessly categorize bearings for maximum engine efficiency. His custom-drilled fuel compression jigs went next. These were of high value, as they were the literal instruments used to pull off his historic track escapes. Next were the cars, especially the 1972 Chevrolet Vega GT prototype. General Motors secretly funded it during the 1970s gas crisis to see how much power Smokey could wring out of a weak-stock 110-horsepower engine. He bolted on a ported iron cylinder head, rejetted a 350 cubic feet per minute Rochester two-barrel carburetor, and fitted a specialized Schwitzer turbocharger to a custom manifold huffing 7 pounds of boost. Decades later, it crossed the block at a premier Mecum auction, part of Larry's legacy, and sold for over $68,000. What the corporate world once dismissed as a cheap economy car was now valued as a priceless relic of independent American genius. But, as the metal tools and machines left the shop, a strict line was being drawn by the Smokey family. Not everything was to be sold. Protected by blood. Smokey had spent his career fighting the automotive establishment with his voice and ideas, all of which were flatly refused. After watching too many brilliant ideas get buried by corporate interests, the Yunick family were determined to make sure that Smokey's intellectual legacy would not suffer the same fate. So, when corporate representatives came to scavenge Smokey's secrets, they were sent away empty-handed. The task of safeguarding this intellectual treasure fell to Smokey's daughter, Trish Smokey Brown, who took physical possession of her father's personal diaries and private correspondence. She locked them away in a secure family vault, protecting them from prying eyes and predatory interests. They contained his private frustrations, his secret triumphs, his relationships with the drivers, executives, and engineers who had populated his remarkable life. Trish understood that these papers were the truest record of who her father had been. Among the most fascinating items in that vault were Smokey's personal stack of NASCAR rule books, each one heavily annotated and aggressively marked up. Why were they marked up? Well, probably to find loopholes just like the one that allowed him to build a 7/8 scale Chevelle and an 11-foot fuel line. For years, Trish worked meticulously, combing through those journals and annotated rulebooks, assembling the fragments of her father's life into one single coherent narrative. It wasn't easy to handle thousands of pages of dense technical prose mixed with personal reflections and bitter of his enemies. But she persevered, determined to create a literary piece that would live forever. The result was a massive 3-volume autobiography titled The Best Damn Garage in Town: The World According to Smokey. It ran to 1,100 pages, weighed 11 pounds, and contained more than 400 photographs and illustrations. It was Smokey in all his unvarnished glory: opinionated, profane, brilliant, and utterly uncompromising. When the autobiography was finally published, it shook the racing industry to its foundations. Smokey, speaking from beyond the grave, called out corrupt NASCAR executives by name, accusing them of everything from incompetence to outright criminality. He named Bill France Sr. specifically, calling him a holy roller draft dodger and accusing him of selling stolen government merchandise. The revelations were explosive, the accusations devastating, and the racing establishment found itself on the defensive against a dead man who had been planning his posthumous attack for years. The book became an instant sensation, selling out its initial print run and establishing Smokey's reputation as the most feared critic of the sport he had helped build. But as shocking as the autobiography was, it was only the beginning of the revelations. The most dangerous thing Smokey built was still waiting to be deployed. One last trick. During the public auction, people couldn't help but notice that something was missing: the hot vapor engines and their accompanying schematics. But that wasn't a mistake at all. The Yunick family had intentionally kept it away. They had a deep and truly justified fear that a corporate car manufacturer would buy the technology only to bury it. The hot vapor cycle had directly challenged the entire industry, and if it got into the wrong hands, it would be locked away, never to be seen again. It was Smokey's greatest achievement, and his family weren't going to let that happen. When they finally sold the technology, it was a private sale to Tony Allers, the close family friend who had previously purchased a substantial portion of Smokey's tooling at the public auction. He was a true believer in hot vapor technology, a man who had been a friend and customer of Smokey for years. The family trusted him to keep the experimental collection safely unified and out of corporate hands. So, Tony was charged with ensuring that Smokey's vision survived its creator and found its way to people who would actually use it. Years later, Hill Country Performance of Spring Branch, Texas, tracked down Allers and purchased the entire lot of hot vapor assets: the engines, the comprehensive engineering blueprints, the prototypes. The acquisition moved the collection into a high-security Texas vault, where it could be studied, preserved, and eventually deployed. Hill Country Performance was exactly the kind of independent operation Smokey would have approved of, not a corporate monolith, but a dedicated group of enthusiasts who understood the value of what they had acquired. But before his demise, Smokey had another trick up his sleeve. He purposefully allowed his hot vapor patents to lapse and expire. By allowing the patents to expire, he made the technology effectively open source, available to anyone with the skill and determination to build it. 10 years after Smokey Yunick passed away, his insistence that nothing of value remained in his garage turned out to be prophetic when a massive, mysterious fire completely burned the best damn garage in town to the ground. What used to be his fortress was reduced to ash and twisted metal. But, with his ideas scattered into the hands of people, Smokey's legacy was immortal. Do you think something else was hidden in that garage before it burned down? And how much of Smokey's genius is still being used today? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.